Did you know that when giving Bikurim, under certain circumstances, the container you brought the Bikurim in went to the Kohen as well? Now, those circumstances are subject to 4 different ways of understanding what role that container plays in the Bikurim. And believe it or not, that has a lesson for us in terms of our entire Jewish journey. Let's start with the facts. This week's parasha speaks about Bikurim, and the halacha is that Bikurim need to be brought in a container. The Rambam makes that clear. Says Dr. Rambam. Then the Rambam tells us, depending on what type of container it is, there'll be different halachas. If a person brought their Bikurim in a metal container, precious metal or regular metal, then the Kohen takes the contents, takes the Bikurim for himself, and he has to return, very important words, he has to return the vessel back to the owner. Whereas if the person brought it in a reed basket or a grass basket or something like that, then then the Bikurim and the container, the basket in which it is held, is both given to the Kohen. So what we need to understand about this is the makar from the din is Mefarshim Sachin on the Mishnah in Bikurim. So the Mefarshim point out that what's the basis of the Rambam ruling this halacha? A Mishnah in Bikurim which says as follows. Now listen for the differences between the language and approach of the Mishnah versus the Rambam. The Mishnah says, wealthy people used to bring their Bikurim in these containers made of gold or silver, whereas and the poor people they'd bring them in these these reed or grass baskets made out of arava twigs that had been peeled. In other words, you took off the outer part of it. And in that case, those baskets were given to the Kohanim. Based on that, the Gemara learns, the Gemara in Bava Kama learns based on that Mishnah, that so where do people get this principle from where they say after a poor person follows poverty? Ditnan, based on this Mishnah in Bikurim, that if a poor person brings their Bikurim in their simple basket, the basket goes along to the Kohen as well. Now we're going to decode exactly what the Gemara is talking about over there. But from them is mashma pashtus. What is clear from the way the Mishnah says things is as the chilek zwischen kalosah shel zov and salin etzorim v'ensachin das hanosim, that the difference between the wealthy person who brings his big fancy container versus the poor person who brings his simple basket is their intention is completely different. Because naturally you expect that wealthy people bring their Bikurim in these very fancy gold or silver containers. You could assume that the wealthy person did not intend to give such an expensive item away to the Kohen. As Rashi clearly says, the wealthy people did not give, implying they did not want to give their beautiful containers to the Kohanim. Why? Because they're expensive. So because their intention was never to give away those containers, they remain the property of the owners. Whereas poor people, because they're bringing their Bikurim in these simple baskets, because they can't afford anything more expensive, so they actually had the intention to give the baskets together with the Bikurim to the Kohen, which is the reason why the Kohanim get to keep the baskets. And that would make sense why the Gemara then develops a principle out of this, which is that the Gemara is telling us this is the psychology. Because a person is poor, it's only natural that he'll bring his Bikurim in something which is poor, cheap. So, Basar Anya, because he's a poor person, as the Aniyusa, what he comes with to present is something poor. And what he brings, which is cheap, ozle, that goes to the recipient, to the Kohen as well. The Kohen keeps the basket. That's the Mishnah, and the Gemara in Bava Kama. You'll notice the Rambam didn't say that. The Rambam aber is matgestimmt chilek zwischen klei matris and klei harava. The Rambam only distinguished not between wealthy and poor people, but between metal and reed baskets. He says nothing about the person's financial status. It's the full mashma, which implies that as far as the Rambam is concerned, it's not about the intention of the giver of the Bikurim. was wenn sich in der Teigkeit or the Billigkeit from the Kelim, which would depend on whether these are expensive or cheap items. Expensive ones I want to keep, cheap ones I'm willing to give away. Aber fragt, das Klematres kann euch sein, als was hat nicht ein größer Shivoi. It's actually possible that you could have metal that is a cheap metal. Could be tin, for example. Now, the Chelek is verbunden mit den Sug HaKelek Shele Atzmoi. The Rambam seems to focus here on the nature of the container. Where there'll be a distinction if it's metal or if it's made out of reeds and grass. If that's true, then we have to understand what is the Rambam's logic. As those, was die Gemara sagt, im Moket zum Klau Domer in Shabbos Anyer v'chulei von der Mishnah in Bikurim, Asher Mevin chulei. The Gemara said that we have this principle that after the poor person follows the cheap item, and that's learned from the fact that the wealthy and the poor brought different kinds of containers. Meint es nicht der Fall, was bei Akeli shall oni is das and lessons given the Keli zum Kohen. The Rambam's interpretation of that Gemara is not that it was the intention of the poor man to give away his basket, not from the Masuba von der Halacha, but rather it's because of what kind of a basket it was. And oni kiroga bringt in klein sorry, because it's typical for a poor person to bring a reed basket. Such a basket has to belong to the Kohen, has to stay with the Kohen. Why? If it's not because of the intention of the giver. So we have to understand where's the Rambam coming from. So before we can get there, we're going to have a look at the Sifri. If in Pasuk, the Pasuk that says that the Kohen will take the container, the basket, from the hands of the person bringing the Bikurim, steht in Sifri. The Sifri says this. Mekan Omru. From here we learn that wealthy people would bring the Bikurim in fancy gold and silver containers, whereas poor people would bring from these peeled twigs of arabis. And then the poor people would give their baskets to the Kohanim to add an additional gift to the Kohanim over and above the Bikurim. What do you mean to add an additional gift? So let him Mephoshim explain what the Sifri is identifying over here is a word in the pasuk. From the word hatene, because the Torah says that the Kohen will take the basket, and there's an emphasis on the basket. Surely we didn't have to say, the Kohen just said he'll take the Bikurim. Why do we have to know that he's taking the basket of Bikurim? Says this, the Mephoshim, what the Sifri is identifying here is if the kind of container that the Bikurim came in was cheap, just a tenner, a simple basket, then the Kohen takes the basket. Whereas if it was a fancier container made out of metal, the Kohen would not be permitted to take the basket. So the word tenner is really important. Why is that? So the Sifri explains, why does the Kohen get to keep his basket? To add the gift to the Kohen. What does that mean? With the Tosis Yontav is Mavor, the Tosis Yontav explains as follows. Because we're dealing with a poor person, so therefore the Bikurim is actually a meager offering. Therefore they instituted that the poor person should not only give his Bikurim, but he should add to it also the container. When you add the basket to the Bikurim, now it's a more appropriate gift to give to the Kohen. So that's beautiful, the Sifri and the Tosis Yontav. Clearly not what the Rambam is saying. Because this perspective is still not a distinction between what kind of container you're carrying, nor in Kamas HaPeres, but rather in how much your Bikurim includes. In the which takes us right back to the distinction between wealthy and poor. The Rambam does not make that distinction. But he says the Rambam is nor mechalek kenal ben sugya kelim atzmom or need the mechalek ben anim v'ashirim in kamas haperes v'chagefinnen sich in the kelim. The Rambam clearly is only distinguishing between a container made of metal versus a container made of reeds. Nothing to do with wealth or poverty. Nothing to do with the amount of bikurim. So where's the Rambam coming from? What we're going to illustrate is that there are three fundamental principles about how what role the basket plays in the Bikurim, and then there's the Rambam's fourth view. The explanation is this. There are various ways that we can understand what role the basket plays in the gift of Bikurim to the Kohen. We're going to look at three. They are as follows. Aleph. The most basic, simple understanding is the shaychus with the Bikurim is not bahava osam. The relationship between the basket and the Bikurim is that the basket is a vehicle to get the Bikurim to Yerushalayim. Aber der Din, wegzugeben, die Salim zu die Kahanim, ist aber so untergriffene Sinne. So once the Bikurim get to Yerushalayim, if we're then told that the basket goes to the Kohen, that's unrelated to Bikurim. That's a completely different thing. In the process of Bikurim, the basket is just a vehicle. Once the Bikurim are being given, now there's an additional concept of giving the basket as well. And that is not part of the mitzvah of Bikurim. So the first explanation is, there's Bikurim, and there's a concept of giving a basket which is independent. Second perspective base. No, the reality is, you cannot escape the fact that this basket is here because of Bikurim. So if you're going to give the basket to the Kohen, it must somehow be related to giving him Bikurim. What is the relationship? If you brought that kind of a basket, you are now obligated to give the basket to the Kohen. Once a person has the requirement to give Bikurim to the Kohen, what gets swept into that responsibility is to give the basket as well, if it's a poor person who brought that kind of basket. But from this perspective, handing over that basket to the Kohen does not equate to the mitzvah of handing over the Bikurim to the Kohen. It's linked to the responsibility of giving a Kohen, but it's not the same action. Which brings us to the third perspective, Gimel, or the Nachmer, far deeper. As the Sheiches is not only is the link between giving the Kohen a basket and giving the Bikurim a basket, that these are two obligations the poor person has, but actually it's one package deal, it's one motion, one action. The Bikurim und die Salim darf gegeben werden bechod machte in ein Meise Nesina, that you actually have to give the basket with the Bikurim as a single gift to the Kohen. Okay, now each of these is going to have a practical application. We're going to first look at a very simple practical application between them, and then we'll look at something further. Let's go with the first perspective, which is, I have a mitzvah to give Bikurim, and then besides that, and related to that, once the basket is there, I should be giving it to a Kohen. As a shaychus from the Salam to Bikurim is nor in the Habo lebeis havaya lekecha. Pasuk says you've got to bring Bikurim to the house of Hashem your God, so you bring the Bikurim, once you're there, you've got the basket as well, now you give the basket to the Kohen. But what was the role of the basket? To get the Bikurim to Hashem's house. And therefore, practically, the nature of giving this basket to a Kohen, nothing at all to do with giving the Bikurim to the Kohen, which then implies I could give this basket to any Kohen, does not have to be the same Kohen who received the Bikurim. In fact, not only that, doesn't even have to be somebody who's part of the team of Kohanim who are on duty at that particular time, as long as it goes to a Kohen. Because it's got nothing to do with the Bikurim, it's just something I have to do for a Kohen. It doesn't have to be a Kohen on duty. Whereas, like in Sveiten, even if I take the second approach, which said, why is a person obligated to give the basket? Because they were obligated to give Bikurim. Well, then logic says the Bikurim belong to the Kohanim who are on duty. So therefore the baskets that accompany those Bikurim should also belong to the Kohanim who are on duty. Just like the Bikurim themselves. But I don't have to hand this basket to the same person I'm giving the Bikurim. I could give him the Bikurim and him the basket. Whereas, like the third perspective, which was as a shayches is in them, as a staff in where it's not just that they are two linked processes; they're a single process. It's supposed to be one action of giving a basket of Bikurim to the Kohen. Then it's Pasha, that's das very gegeben zu demselben Kohen Kahanim, but myself on me to Bikurim. Well, then obviously the same Kohen that receives the Bikurim must be the same Kohen who is receiving the basket for obvious reasons. But Pizei Shloimar, as in dem steht der Chilek zwischen Droshas HaSifri lefi Muvana Kipshutoi, Droshas HaGemara and Baba Kama lefi Pirish Rashi, on the Pirish B'Hateisus Yomtov Chulei B'Sifri. Okay, so we've already identified three different perspectives. We already identified that there was the Sifri, from here we learn that you give the basket. There was the Gemara in Bava Kama and Rashi's perspective on the Gemara, which is about the wealthy and the poor. And then there was the Tosfos Yom Tov who's saying that the poor person has to, and Rashi's also saying the intention of the giver, because if you're bringing something more fancy, you don't really intend to give it to the Kohen, whereas the poor person doesn't mind. And then there's the Tosfos Yom Tov who says that the issue is you want to embellish the gift, and therefore you include the basket in the poor man's case. So, Aleph. Von dem, was der Din, als Salam geht man ab zu den Kohanim, wird in Sifri abgegeben von Pasuk, let's start with the Sifri. The Sifri learned, where do we get this idea that the person giving Bikurim should give the basket as well? Because the Torah told us, that if it's a cheap basket, the Kohen takes it. That means that the Sifri is identifying a word in the pasuk, not related specifically to Bikurim. The word is teneh, the basket, from which we learn you have to give the basket. And the Sifri reiterates that at the end where it says, and the baskets must be given to the Kehanim. In other words, the Sifri does not use language like the Mishnah, and in fact the Rambam does as well, where we group together the baskets and the Bikurim. No, we focus in the Sifri specifically on the baskets. Is mashma that implies as a chiyuv to give the salim so the Kehanim is abazunidin b'anesina nititin asinas Bikurim. That implies that the Sifri's perspective is giving the baskets to the Kohanim is unrelated to the mitzvah of Bikurim itself. And das is kavanas Sifri b'siyumoi, which the Sifri then clarifies at the end, where it says lezakis matana leKayanim. Well, there you have it. To give the Kohanim a gift, that implies it's another gift. It's not the Bikurim gift. It's a different gift. This is another gift that the poor person has by giving the basket to the Kohen. So the Sifri must be of the view that giving the basket is a separate concept from giving Bikurim. So in the Gemara of Bava Kama, which quoted the Mishnah in Bikurim to prove the point that after poor people follows poverty, so Rashi immediately pointed out in his commentary there, that for the wealthy people, they would not give their fancy dishes, containers to the Kohanim. That implies that the reason the poor people are giving their baskets to the Kohanim is because there's some kind of lack in their Bikurim mitzvah itself. Therefore, they're giving, in addition to the Bikurim, the baskets as well. So the Gemara there is saying, because they're giving a more meager Bikurim, therefore they have a chiyuv to also give the basket. But it's not yet implying that giving the basket is part of the process of giving Bikurim. It's almost kind of like it's a chiyuv linked to the giving of Bikurim. In fact, the whole expression the Gemara is building over here is after the poor person follows the poverty. So after the poor person is given his Bikurim, follows this cheap basket that goes as well. Well, if the cheap basket is actually part of the process of giving Bikurim, the expression follows wouldn't apply. Whereas Gimel Leit and Pirush HaTosefos Yontif B'chulei in Sifri, when you have the perspective of the Tosefos Yontif, how the Tosefos Yontif explains the Sifri, Shohanim Evin Me'at, because the problem is that poor people bring meager offerings. Ve'im Asal Yenech Shematona, so you have to add the basket to their gift in order to make it a beautiful gift. So the implication is the basket completes the role of Bikurim that it could be considered a gift. That lends itself to the concept that you've got to give the Bikurim and the basket in one shot. So that the Bikurim itself is substantial and is dignified as a gift to give to the Kohanim. So those are the three possibilities. The Rambam comes from a fourth perspective. So it turns out that the Rambam applies a fourth approach, which is radically beyond the three that we've already learned. In other words, the most innovative perspective we had so far was that when the poor person gives the basket, as the Tosefos Yontif explains in the Sifri, that actually finishes off his role of giving the Bikurim. Says the Rambam, it's not only that. Not only is it one action, but the basket is one concept with bringing Bikurim. In other words, when as a person completed the concept of bringing Bikurim, you only really have fulfilled the mitzvah Bikurim if you brought your Bikurim in a container and in such a way that the container is considered part of the Bikurim. In different words, the connection between the basket and the Bikurim is not only in terms of my responsibility as the bringer of Bikurim, that in the same action that I'm bringing the Bikurim, I am also giving the basket. Not only is it the action itself, that it's a single action that moves both the bikurim and the basket to the person, which are the two other perspectives we saw, the Gemara and the Sifri, according to the Tosafos Yom Tov. Now, the Rambam's innovating that the object which is being included, the basket which is being affected by my actions, becomes a different class of basket. It's no longer a regular basket, it is now a bikurim basket. Und das macht der Rambam klar mit dem, was stellt die Halacha heavy an b'chli matris chulei. That's why you can see this in the fact that the Rambam presents this halacha straight after straight after the previous halacha, which says in order for bikurim to be bikurim, they have to be in a vessel. Nicht wie in der Mishnah, wo das weggebracht als Abazunde din halacha in einem Ofen Avov von Asher Varnir. And that's completely different to the Mishnah. The Mishnah spoke about the idea that that bikurim has to come in a container, and then independently of that, spoke about who's bringing the bikurim, are they wealthy, are they not, what happens to the baskets, etc. Das heißt, dass die Kehle ist verbunden und wird einsach mit der bikurim. In other words, the perspective that the Rambam is coming from is that the container of the bikurim is part of the bikurim. It's core to the bikurim. Und in dem Din ist ein Tokenchlich zwischen ein Kehle und ein Zweiten. It doesn't matter what kind of container it is. The fact is, the container is critical to the mitzvahs bikurim. Now we'll look at the language the Rambam used. And das, was the Rambam is machalik zwischen klei matris and klei arava v'chelef. So then why did the Rambam distinguish between metal or reed kelem? Is not the far was by clay matches is doadin meyuchad. It's exactly the opposite of what we thought. Up until now, we thought that there was a special law for regular baskets that they go to the kohanim. The Rambam's telling us, no, there's a special law for metal baskets that they don't go to the kohanim. In fact, not only don't they go to the kohanim, his language is very specific. Actually, the keli has to go back. That's an important language. Go back, an important deal. Go back to the owner. Das heißt, meaning what? Mitzad, the bikurim mitzvahs have awesome. In context of bikurim and the mitzvah to bring bikurim, vertically, when you're bringing your bikurim, the container is part of the bikurim. It's indistinguishable from the bikurim itself. It's only when the bikurim are in the container that you fulfill the mitzvah of bringing bikurim to the Beis HaMikdash. It's only that after you've now fulfilled that, you've brought your bikurim, you've given it to the kohen, that mitzvah is now done, then the vessel can go back to the owner. Meaning it does not become an asset of the kohen's. Whereas if it's reed or grass baskets, then the vessel does not go back to the owner. The basket remains one and the same as the bikurim throughout. Now, why would that be? There's a logical reason. The connection between the metal container, the golden bowl, and the bikurim that's in it is because the Torah requires that there has to be a container. Der Rebbe is echt der Verbund von der Kli mit the Peres from bikurim no beginner mitzvah. So the only reason that there's a golden bowl over here is because there's a mitzvah to bring your bikurim in a container. Once you've done the mitzvah, there's no relevance to the container anymore. All you needed was to have a vehicle to bring the keli to Hashem's home. Whereas if it's a reed basket, firstly, it's similar material to the produce. I mean, that's produce, this is produce. And the value of the basket is more similar to the value of the produce. Then is das a hanitzim gedakerisha bahem bikurim to unim kli as das vetter gamer ve'in zachmit de peres. The fact that there's so much similarity between the container and the products that are in the container, therefore it remains fundamentally one with the bikurim. Just like if you think about it, the peels of the pomegranates are part of the mitzvah's bikurim, even though you're not going to use those pomegranates, you're not going to eat them, you're not going to eat the peels. So in the same way, the basket is like a container, it's like the outer shell of the bikurim. I'm talking so with that, we can focus on 4 nuances in the Rambam's language that all now suit what the Rambam's just told us, which is this radical concept that the container of the bikurim is part and parcel of the core mitzvah of bikurim. And the only time you get your container back is if it was metal and it doesn't have that relationship with the produce, so it can be excused and returned to the owner. Number 1, Aleph. The fact that the Rambam completely disregarded the status of the person bringing bikurim, asher va'ani, whether he's wealthy or poor. The entire nature of his language was only to speak about the action as it relates to the item, which is the bikurim. Did you bring those bikurim in a metal container? Or did you bring them in a reed basket? Well, now we understand why. Because he's not talking about our action, he's talking about the fact that the bikurim and the container are a single entity. Number 2 base. As Mashano Mashmatim Lashena Mishnah von Sifri Gemara, he also changes and even leaves out words that both the Sifri and the Mishnah used, which were Vasalim Vabikurim Noisnim Onitonim Lakayanim. They both spoke about the fact that you give the basket to the Kohen, or that the basket is given to the Kohen. The Rambam just says the bikurim and the baskets belong to the Kohen. Nothing about the giving, lahadgish, to emphasize. Illustrating, I don't agree with the other shittas, which say the reason you're giving the basket is because you had an obligation to give bikurim, or the reason you're giving the basket is because perhaps your bikurim were looking a little bit shemsich, so you want to put a basket to embellish it. He's not saying it's not about giving it to the Kohen. Rather, rather, the Rambam lumps them together as a single entity. The bikurim and the baskets are a single entity. Number 3, Gimel. Interestingly, the Rambam reverses the order of how the Mishnah lists the 2 key items over here, because the Mishnah says the baskets and the bikurim go to the Kohanim. On Shait, bikurim v'asalim, whereas the Rambam says the bikurim and the baskets go to the Kohanim. Now, at first glance, that may not seem significant. But the point is, we know the bikurim are going to the Kohen because that's the core mitzvah. The fact that the baskets are going to the Kohanim, that's the surprise. So you would have expected, first tell us what we don't know. Tell us the baskets are going to the Kohanim, together with the bikurim. But the Rambam switches it because if you say the baskets and the bikurim go to the Kohanim, you could read it as die Salim ständig frier is a besondere Inyan von the bikurim. You could say the baskets go to the Kohanim because there's a separate obligation to give the basket to the Kohen. And then the bikurim go to the Kohen because there's another mitzvah to give the bikurim to the Kohen. That's why the Rambam reverses it to say the bikurim go to the Kohen that we know is the primary responsibility. Vehasalim, together with that the basket. Oh, I didn't see that coming. Clearly, what the Rambam is illustrating is that the baskets are a secondary element that are given with the bikurim to the Kohen, because that's the Rambam Shita, that the baskets and the bikurim are a single entity. Lastly, Daled, the Rambam concludes that if the bikurim become contaminated, then you don't get the Kohen doesn't get the baskets. That's completely logical, because if the whole approach of the Rambam is that the basket and the bikurim are one and the same entity, then what's going to determine whether the basket should go to the Kohanim? The status of the bikurim. So if the bikurim are disqualified because they're contaminated, naturally, goes without saying, the baskets do not go to the Kohanim. Question is, what we have to understand at a deeper level is, what's the link, conceptually, between bikurim and the container? Obviously, we understand in practical terms you have to have a keli, bikurim to kli. We get that. But conceptually, what's the connection? In fact, especially if you're talking about something which is made out of cheap materials, reeds, etc. In fact, they seem to be complete opposites. Bikurim represent the best of the best. Pashtus, begashmis, bohem atzmam. Firstly, physically, they have to be merashis, going with the first fruits. And bikurim only applies to the 7 special species that are the praise of Israel. So that tells you it's the best of the best. If a person brought a different kind of fruit, it wouldn't be sanctified, would not be considered bikurim. Besides that, spiritually, when do bikurim happen? Only when there's a Beis Hamikdash, and only if you're in Eretz Yisrael. So it's the best of the best and the holiest of the holiest. The land that has special oversight from Hashem. And even within that very specific range of what qualifies as bikurim, they have to be the best of that particular species of fruit. You don't bring You don't bring dates from mountaintops, and you don't bring produce from valleys. And you don't bring olives that don't have the best oil. We bring dates from the valleys, and we pay and produce from the hills. Because they have to be the best of the best. If you don't bring the best of the best, it's disqualified as bikurim. So what does bikurim represent? The highest, the best, the most wholesome. And then we say that in order for bikurim to be bikurim, they have to be in a container. So that immediately tells you that the mitzvah of bikurim is directly linked in to something which is very finite, very limited, a keli. So look at what the Rambam concluded, as we already saw. If the bikurim are contaminated, which means you cannot now present them in front of the mizbeach, and the kohanim don't get the baskets, that tells you that there's this incredible link between the bikurim and the baskets. So clearly, if the kohanim then keep the baskets, because the baskets are clearly part of the bikurim, clearly that's a better version of bikurim. But the only time that you actually get for the kohen to keep the basket is if it's the cheapest version of the basket. Literally, like the dregs. How do you square that off? Bikurim have to be the best of the best, but the only time that you have the best version of giving bikurim, which is where the keli goes to the kohen, is only if the kohen is, if the keli is the least of the least. Of Signan Kotzer. Briefly. Wie kommt es? As bei Bikurim was ein Kishmon Bikurim, die ersten, die beste Beschevecharetz. How does it make sense that Bikurim, which as the name reflects, are the very choicest part of what the land has to offer? Was darf in gebracht werden in Beis Habai Lekecho, that have to go to the Eibishter's home. Bis lifnei Mizbech Hashem Lekecho, in front of the Mizbeach. So die Schleime sein verbunden dafür mit Keli. That the best version of Bikurim has to specifically be in a container, in the limitations of a container, of a Goli Yosef Bechli Arav Bechedef, and specifically the cheapest of all containers. Shleimah Debir, and then the explanation is beautiful. This is Yodua, as Bikurim Zaimiram Sefidin. We know that Bikurim are a metaphor for the Jewish people. The pasuk says, I saw your forefathers, Hashem says, like the first fruit, the first of the first fruits appearing on the tree. But the Tzemach Tzedek is in Mevorah Baruch, as the Tzemach Tzedek explains at length, as in from Bikurim, Vaisef Neshamis Yisovis is B'Shoshim L'Mayla, that actually Bikurim illustrates how the Jewish soul is at its absolute source. At that level, the thought, the concept of the Jewish people is beyond and precedes the concept of everything Torah included. That's why in halacha, when you bring your different gifts to the kohanim, you first have to give bikurim before you even give truma. Even though both of them are referred to in the Torah as the beginning. So why were the bikurim chosen to be the beginning of all beginnings? In spite of the fact that truma is called reishis, right? Still we put the bikurim first. Why is that? But the reishis from truma oisis Torah mem, because what truma represents, the first gift to the kohanim, the word truma is related to the letter mem and the word Torah. Is the Inyan Torah, so therefore Truma represents the concept of Torah. And about Torah, Shlomo HaMelech says that David established Torah as the beginning of his path. And the Reishis from Bikurim is Ram Sefidin. As we've pointed out, the Reishis of Bikurim refers to the Jewish people. That we are sanctified to David as the first of his crops. So seeing as we know that the Jewish people predate the Torah, as in the same way, Bikurim have to come before Truma. So now that we've identified that the neshama at its source precedes everything that exists, and lives with this absolute connection to the Eibishter, as the pasuk says, that I live in front of the Eibishter, stand in front of the Eibishter, and in a state of absolute purity. Yet the reality is that the neshama has to come down into the body, which is a keli, a container, a limiting container, which interferes with the relationship the neshama has to Hashem. And the keli, the body, the human experience, blocks and blinds us to the nature of our neshama's connection and bond with Hashem. That's like bikurim in a container made out of the cheap reeds. But we know very well, as the we know very well that this tremendous decline from the top of rooftops all the way down into the deepest pits is actually worthwhile. It's descent for the purpose of greater ascent. Specifically by the neshama descending into this highly limiting experience of the human body. That will effect for the neshama such a tremendous rebound and elevation as if that the neshama is then elevated even higher than it was at its original source, which was so tremendously high, greater than Torah, Kadma l'chol davar, etc. Durch dem in through the experience of living in this world and doing Hashem's mitzvahs, that exposes the truth of the bikurim. That not only are we bound to the Eibishter, but that in our essence we are one with Hashem's essence. So generally that is a description of the experience of the neshama coming down into this world. But more specifically, that relates to what we do in this world to serve the Eibishter. The ultimate purpose of our service of Hashem is not so much about engaging in great lofty spiritual things, but specifically when we do physical, practical mitzvahs. When we actually do the mitzvahs, which requires action, which is the most underdeveloped part of the human being. What that does is converts the entire body to become a container, vessel, vehicle for the Eibishter. That causes the ultimate elevation of the neshama. To the extent that the ultimate experience of divine revelation, which will happen in the time of Mashiach, will only happen when neshamas return to bodies, because this is the forum in which we experience the very essence of our neshama. Why is it that way? So the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya. The idea of the cascading evolution of worlds, each world becoming lower than the next, is not for the benefit or purpose of the higher worlds, because they experience decline, they experience degradation. What is the ultimate purpose? Our lowly physical world. Our physical world is the lowest spiritual strata. There's nothing lower than it. So why is that the staging ground of the greatest achievement of history? Because that's what the Eibishter desired, that he should have a home specifically in the lowest world. Specifically when we convert our very limited keli, reed basket version of the world into the place where Hashem is completely at home and completely exposed at his essence, that doesn't only elevate our world, but naturally, automatically, like the Alter Rebbe's famous lever metaphor, you lift the lowest part and everything above it gets lifted as well. The same kind of concept applies to the neshama. Specifically, when the neshama descends into this very lowly world, inside the limiting container called the body. And in that environment achieves Hashem's objective, which is to make the lowest world into his home. Which could only be achieved by activities in the physical world. Not only are we engaged with the physical world, but the lowest parts of the physical world, which means doing mitzvahs through human actions, that impacts the ultimate holiness and the ultimate purity of the neshama and the body, and the two of them together. And that elevates the neshama exponentially higher than its incredible state that it was before it entered into this world. That is the symbol of the Bikurim inside the Keli. In the same way as this represents what the spiritual nature of Bikurim is, so that must then be reflected in the actual physical activity of bringing Bikurim. How do Bikurim arrive at Hashem's home? In other words, how do Bikurim arrive in this place of divine exposure? And achieve their greatest holiness? Specifically, if they're in a container. Und in Keli Gufa is Isachtus HaKeli L'Tomid in a Keli von Dvarim Achip Pshutim B'Pchusim in Ta'ei Tach Namatim and Klei Arava V'Chelef. And where do you find the ultimate connection between the Keli and the Bikurim, to the extent that the Keli becomes part of the Bikurim for the long term? Dafka, when what you're using for that Keli is the lowest items. In the same way as when do you find the ultimate connection between the Neshama and Hashem, or the ultimate fulfillment of Hashem's objective, when you engage in the lowest aspects of the world, Ma'aseh B'Foel. By learning these halachas, from both the perspectives of Nigla, the halachic, the midrash, etc., and Pnimis HaTorah Chassidus, and especially if we're learning it at the time of year when we're reading this mitzvah in the parasha, it's also the season, by the way, that in the times of bringing Bikurim, this is when you'd bring Bikurim, at this time of the year between Shavuos and Simchas Torah. So by learning these halachas, that speeds up the fulfillment of the bracha that is always associated with Bikurim, to be able to bring Bikurim again next year. Havas Bikurim b'Pashas in the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, which translate for us into literally being able to bring Bikurim in the third Beis Hamikdash. We should be able to see the construction of the Beis Hamikdash immediately, and through that we'll be able to celebrate all the goodness and bracha that Hashem has given us, which is part of what you're supposed to do during Bikurim, and we'll be able to live life with the ultimate state of simcha that should happen immediately.